is chapter 33 of Laura Hillenbrand's book Unbroken. In chapter 32, the prisoner of war camps were liberated, and so Louis saw his last sight of Nuetsu. Remember that the bird had just kind of disappeared. He had left, and they never heard from him again, and all of the prisoners were headed home. So Louis headed back to America. Hence, this chapter is called Mother's Day, and it starts on page 326. So here we go. The Nuetsu POWs had control of the train. At every town on the line, the train squealed to a stop, and the men piled off, then piled back on, laden with liberated sake and whatever else they could steal. The journey went on, sake coursed through the skinny bodies, and the men grew rowdier. A lieutenant stood up and, with solemn officiousness, warned the men to behave themselves. He didn't want anyone falling off the train, he said. At about 3 in the afternoon, the train stopped and began backing up. Just as the lieutenant had feared, a man had gone overboard. As the train rolled backward, the errant POW came into view. It was the lieutenant himself, at least 3 sheets to the wind. He was lucky. All afternoon, drunken POWs staggered off the train, but the train didn't stop for them. They had to find their own way. From the top of Japan to the bottom, trains packed with POWs snaked toward Yokohama. Men pressed their faces to the windows to catch their first glimpse of what all those B-29s had done. Once grand cities were now flat, black stains. Their only recognizable feature, a gridwork of burned roads, passing nothing, leading nowhere. At the first sight of the destruction of their enemy, the POWs cheered. But after the first city, there was another, then another. City after city razed or destroyed. The survivors drifting about like specters or ghosts picking through the rubble. The cheering died away. On Louis's train, the silence came as they passed through Tokyo. A week after Louis had left Omori, 16 square miles of Tokyo and tens and thousands of souls had been immolated by B-29s, like destroyed by burning. So here, initially, they're really happy, right? Because these are their enemies and they've been defeated, their cities have been destroyed. But as the men start to see how much destruction there was and how many people died, right? It says tens of thousands of souls. They stop cheering, and it's just silent because they're recognizing that, yes, these were their enemies, but also these were people whose country's been destroyed. A few of the trains slipped past Hiroshima. Virtually every POW believed that the destruction of this city had saved them from execution. Remember, this is where the atomic bomb was dropped. John Falconer, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, looked out as Hiroshima neared. First there were trees, he told historian Donald Knox. Then the leaves were missing. As you got closer, branches were missing. Closer still, the trunks were gone. And then, as you got in the middle, there was nothing. Nothing. It was beautiful. I realized this was what had ended the war. It meant we didn't have to go hungry any longer or go without medical treatment. I was so insensitive to anyone else's human needs and suffering. I know it's not right to say it was beautiful because it really wasn't, but I believed the end probably justified the means, right? Because he's saying this is the only way the war is going to stop and that I could go home. At 7 in the evening, the Nuetsu train entered bombed-out Yokohama and stopped at the station. Welcome back, boys. Before me, in immaculate khaki uniform and cap, stood an American girl with a magazine cover smile, faultless makeup, and peroxide blonde hair, wrote Tom Wade. After 3.5 years in prison camp, I had been liberated by the great American blonde. The POWs were soon blissfully enveloped in Red Cross nurses, some of whom cried at the sight of them. Perhaps the women weren't all beautiful, but to Ken Marvin, they looked like goddesses. Someone spotted a mess hall, and a charge ensued. In the midst of it stood a journalist, Robert Trumbull. He called out, asking if anyone had a story to tell. As he hurried past, Frank Tinker told him to talk to Louis Zamperini, gesturing toward his friend. Zamperini's dead, said Trumbull, who thought that the man in question didn't even look like the famous runner. He asked Louis if he could prove his identity. Louis pulled out his wallet. The Japanese had cleaned out the main folds, but in a hidden pocket he'd tucked $8, the cartoon that had gotten him and Phil beaten up, and a USC football admissions pass inscribed with his name. Trumbull was astonished. He took Louis aside and began asking questions, and Louis recounted his entire saga. He's telling the whole story. He omitted one detail. For the sake of Mac and his family, he said nothing of how the chocolate had been lost. So even though, remember, early on Mac ate that chocolate, Louis doesn't want to embarrass him or dishonor Mac's memory, so he doesn't talk about it. Phil would do the same, saying that the chocolate had gone overboard. When Louis finished, Trumbull asked him to summarize what he had endured. Louis stood silently. "If I knew I had to go through those experiences again," he finally said, "I'd kill myself." The next morning, Louis was taken to an airfield to be flown to Okinawa, where many POWs were being collected before being sent home. Seeing a table stacked with K rations, he began cramming the boxes under his shirt, brushing off an attendant who tried to assure him that he didn't have to hoard them, as no one was going to starve him anymore. Looking extremely pregnant, Louis boarded his plane. Okay, so he's been without food for so long that anywhere he goes, and especially on a plane, he's going to stuff his clothes with food. Somewhere in the bustle, he'd been separated from his friends. There had been no goodbyes. By 7 that morning, he was airborne, leaving Japan, he hoped, forever. At Okinawa, a staff sergeant named Frank Roisnick stood by the airfield, watching transport planes come in. He was with Louis's old outfit, the 11th Bomb Group, which was now stationed on Okinawa, and he'd come to the airfield to welcome the POWs. They were a pathetic-looking bunch, mostly skin and bones, clad in rags with makeshift footwear, and nervous, he wrote. He walked among them, listening to their stories, marveling at how they had savored the mess hall grub, watching them tear up over photographs of wives and steady girls who, they hoped, hadn't given them up for dead. Rosnick's CO asked him to come to the debriefing of a POW from the 11th. When Rosnick arrived, he saw 3 officers sitting before a drawn, unshaven POW in sun-bleached clothes. The officers were staring at the POW as if in shock. The colonel told Rosnick that the man was Louis Zamperini, and that he had disappeared some 2.5 years earlier. Everyone in the bomb group had thought he was dead. Rosnick was incredulous. He's doubting. It had been his job to write next of kin letters for lost men, and he had probably written to Zamperini's mother, but he no longer remembered. There had been so many such letters. Not one of those men had turned up alive, until now. It was probably sometime later that day when the dead man walked into the 11th Bomb Group's quarters. Jack Cray, who had packed up Louis's belongings on Oahu, captured the reaction to news of Louis's reappearance. Well, I'll be damned. It wasn't the reunion that Louis had anticipated. Most of these men were strangers to him. Many of his friends, he learned, were dead. 225 men from the 11th had gone missing and were presumed dead, including 26 from Louis's 42nd Squadron. Many more had been killed in action. Of the 16 rowdy young officers who had shared the pornographic palace at Oahu, only 4, Louis, Phil, Jesse Stay, and Joe Deasy, were still alive. Louis and Phil had vanished in the Pacific. Deasy had gone home with tuberculosis. Only Stay had completed his 40-mission tour of duty. He'd seen 5 planes on his wing go down, with every man killed, and yet somehow the sum total of damage to his bombers was 1 bullet hole. He'd gone home in March. Someone brought Louis the August 15th issue of the Minneapolis Star-Journal. Near the back was an article entitled "Lest We Forget," discussing athletes who had died in the war. More than 400 amateur, professional, and collegiate athletes had been killed, including 19 pro football players, 5 American League baseball players, 11 pro golfers, and 1920 Olympic champion sprinter Charlie Paddock, whom Louis had known. There on the page with them, Louis saw his own picture and the words "Great Miler, killed in action in the South Pacific." The Okinawa mess hall was kept open around the clock for POWs who couldn't stop eating. Louis headed straight for it, but was stopped at the door. Because the Japanese never registered him with the Red Cross, his name wasn't on the roster. As far as the mess was concerned, Louis wasn't a POW. He encountered the same problem when trying to get a new uniform to replace the pants and shirt that he had worn every day since May 27, 1943. Until the snafu was straightened out, he had to subsist on candy bars from the Red Cross nurses. So even though he's finally rescued, he can't get anything because he hypothetically doesn't exist. Soon after Louis' arrival, he was sent to a hospital to be examined. Like most POWs, engorging day and night, he had gained weight extremely rapidly. He now weighed 143 pounds, just 17 pounds under his weight at the time of the crash. And right here you can see a picture of Louis at this point. It says Louis prepares to board a flight home. But thanks to dramatic water retention, it was a doughy, moon-faced, muscleless weight. He still had volatile dysentery, it's really bad explosive diarrhea, and was as weak as a blade of grass. He was only 28, but his body, within and without, was etched with the trauma of 27 months of abuse and deprivation. The physicians, who knew what Louis had once been, sat him down to have a solemn talk. After Louis left the doctors, a reporter asked him about his running career. "It's finished," he said, his voice sharp. "I'll never run again." The Zamparinis were on edge. Since Louis's crash, his only message to make it to America had been his radio broadcast 10 months earlier. The letters that he had written after the bird had left Aomori had not arrived. Other than the War Department's December confirmation that Louis was a POW, no further word from or about him had come. The papers were full of stories about the murder of POWs, and families couldn't rest easy. The Zamparinis contacted the War Department, but the department had nothing to tell. Sylvia kept writing to Louis, telling him of all they would do when he came home. "Darling, we will take the best of care for you," she wrote. "You shall be King Toots, anything your heart desires. Yes, even redheads and all." But she, like the rest of the family, was scared. Pete, living in his officers' quarters in San Diego, kept calling home to see if news had come. The answer was always no. On the morning of September 9th, Pete was startled awake by a hand on his shoulder, shaking him vigorously. He opened his eyes to see one of his friends bending over him with a huge smile. Trumbull's story had appeared in the Los Angeles Times. The headline said it all: "Zamparini comes back from dead." In a moment, Pete was on his feet, throwing on his clothes. He bolted for a telephone and dialed his parents' number. Sylvia picked up. Pete asked if she'd heard the news. "Did you hear the news?" she repeated back to him. "Did I? Wow!" Pete asked to speak to his mother, but she was too overcome to talk. Louise and Virginia rushed to church to give thanks, then raced home to prepare the house. As she stood in Louis' room, dusting his running trophies, Louise blinked away tears, singing out, "He's on the way home. He's on the way home." "From now on," she said, "September 9th is going to be Mother's Day to me, because that's the day I learned for sure my boy was coming home to stay." "What do you think, Pop?" someone asked Louis' father. "Those Japs couldn't break him," Anthony said. "My boy's pretty tough, you know." Oh, I love this moment for Louis' family. Not sure in the moment, do want to just remind you that Japs is a derogatory term for Japanese people. It's offensive. We don't use it today, but it's in here because that would have been the term that was the term that Louis' dad used. It wasn't necessarily thought of in the way it is today, but we do not use it today, just to clarify. Liberation, or freedom, was a long time coming for Phil and Fred at Rokashuri. After the August 22nd announcement of the war's end, the POWs sat there waiting for someone to come get them. They got hold of a radio, and on it they heard chatter from men liberating other camps, but no one came for them. They began to wonder if anyone knew they were there. It wasn't until September 2nd that B-29s finally flew over Rokoroshi, their pallets hitting the rice paddies with such force that the men had to dig them out. The POWs ate themselves silly. One man downed 20 pounds of food in a single day, but somehow didn't get sick. That afternoon, an American Navy man dug through his belongings and pulled out his most secret and precious possession. It was an American flag with a remarkable provenance. In 1941, just before Singapore had fallen to the Japanese, an American missionary woman had given it to a British POW. The POW had been loaded aboard a ship which had sunk. 2 days later, another British POW had rescued the flag from where it lay underwater and slipped it to the American Navy man, who had carried it through the entire war, somehow hiding it from the Japanese until this day. The POWs pulled down the Japanese flag and ran the stars and stripes up the pole over Rokoroshi. The men stood before it, hands up in salutes, tears running down their faces. On September 9th, Phil, Fred, and the other POWs were finally trucked off the mountain. Arriving in Yokohama, they were greeted with pancakes, a band playing "California, Here I Come," and a general who broke down when he saw them. The men were escorted aboard a ship for hot showers and more food. On September 11th, the ship set off for home. When news of the Trumbull story reached Indiana, Kelsey Phillips' telephone began ringing, and friends and reporters flocked onto her front porch. Remembering the War Department's request that she not speak publicly of her son's survival, Kelsey kept a smiling silence, awaiting official notification that Alan, remember who still, had been released from the POW camp. It wasn't until September 16th that the War Department telegram announcing Alan's liberation reached her. It was followed by a phone call from her sister, who delivered a message from Alan that had passed from person to person, from Rokuroshi to Yokohama to San Francisco to New Jersey to Indiana. He was free. Alan's friends went downtown and bought newspapers, spread them out on someone's living room floor, and spent the morning reading and crying. As she celebrated, Kelsey thought of what Alan had written in a letter to her. "I would give anything to be home with all of you," the letter said, "but I'm looking forward to the day whenever it comes." That day, Kelsey rejoiced, has come. On Okinawa, Louis was having a grand time, eating, drinking, and making merry. When he was given orders to fly out, he begged a doctor to arrange for him to stay a little longer, on the grounds that he didn't want his mother to see him so thin. The doctor not only agreed to have Louis hospitalized, he threw him a welcome back to life bash, complete with a 5-gallon barrel of bourbon, alcohol mixed with Coke syrup, distilled water, and whatever else was handy. More than a week passed. Bombers left with loads of POWs, and still Louis stayed on Okinawa. The nurses threw him another party. The ersatz bourbon went down easy, and there was a moonlit jeep ride with a pretty girl. Along the way, Louis discovered that a delightful upside to being believed dead was that he could scare the hell out of people. Learning that a former track recruiter from USC was on the island, he asked a friend to tell the recruiter that he had a college running prospect who could spin a mile in just over 4 minutes. The recruiter eagerly asked to meet the runner. When Louis appeared, the recruiter fell over backwards in his chair. On September 17th, a typhoon hit Okinawa. Louis was in a tent when nature called, sending him into the storm to fight his way to an outhouse. He was on the seat with his pants down when a wind gust shot the outhouse over an embankment, carrying Louis in it. Dumped in the mud under a downpour, Louis stood up, hitched up his pants, got broadsided by another gust, and fell over. He crawled through the mud, lizarding his way, as he put it, up the hill. He had to bang on the hospital door for a while before someone heard him. The next morning dawned to find planes flipped over, ships sunk, tents collapsed. Louis, covered in everything that a somersault inside an outhouse will slather on a man, was finally willing to leave Okinawa. He got an enlisted man to pour water over his head while he soaped off, then went to the airfield. When he saw the plane that he was to ride in, he felt a swell of nausea. It was a B-24, which, remember, Louis hasn't been in a B-24 since his crash a couple years before. The first leg of his journey to the Philippine city of Laog went without incident. On the second flight to Manila, the plane was so overloaded with POWs that it nearly crashed just after takeoff, dipping so low that seawater sprayed the POW's legs through gaps in the bomb bay floor. But the bomber made it to Manila, where Louis got passage out on a transport plane. He sat in the cockpit, telling the pilot his story, from the crash to Kwajalein to Japan. As Louis spoke, the pilot dropped the plane down over an island and landed. The pilot asked Louis if he'd ever seen this place before. Louis looked around at a charred wasteland, recognizing nothing. "This is Kwajalein," said the pilot. This couldn't be Kwajalein, Louis thought. In captivity, glimpsing the island through gaps in his blindfold, or when being hustled to interrogation and medical experimentation, he'd seen a vast swath of intense green. Now he couldn't find a single tree. The fight for this place had ripped the jungle off the island. Louis would long wonder if kind-hearted Kawamura had died here. That's the guard that helped him and Phil when they were in Kwajalein. Someone told him that there was, in fact, one tree still standing. They borrowed a jeep and drove over to see it. Staring at Kwajalein's last tree, with food in his belly, no blindfold over his eyes, no one there to beat him, Louis felt as if he were in the sweetest of dreams. On he went to Hawaii. Seeing the condition of the POWs, American authorities had decided to hospitalize virtually all of them. Louis was checked into a Honolulu hospital, where he found himself rooming with Fred Garrett. It was the first time that Louis had slept on a mattress with sheets since the first days after his capture. He was given a new uniform and captain's bars, having been promoted in his imprisonment, as most Army POWs were. Trying on his new clothes, he pulled off his beloved muslin shirt, set it aside, and forgot about it. He went downtown, then remembered the shirt and returned to retrieve it. It had been thrown away. He was heartbroken. Right? It's the only thing he's had with him for years. Louis and Fred hit the town. Seemingly everyone they met wanted to take them somewhere, feed them, buy them drinks. On a beach, they made a spectacle of themselves when Fred, feeling emasculated by the pity over his missing leg, flung away his crutches, hopped over to Louis, and tackled him. The wrestling match drew a crowd of offended onlookers who thought that an able-bodied soldier was beating up a helpless amputee. Swinging around Hawaii, getting drunk, knocking heads with Fred, Louis never let himself for a moment to think of the war. I just thought I was empty, now I'm being filled, he said later, and I just wanted to keep being filled. That October, Tom Wade walked off a transport ship in Victoria, Canada. With a multitude of former POWs, he began a transcontinental rail journey that became a non-stop party, including 8 impromptu weddings. I must have kissed 1,000 girls crossing the continent, Wade wrote to Louis. And when I walked through the train with lipstick all over my face after the first station, I was the most popular officer on the train. In New York, he was taken aboard the Queen Elizabeth to sail for England. He snuck down the gangway, necked with a Red Cross girl, and stole back aboard, toting a box of Hershey bars. When he reached England, he discovered that the local women preferred Yank and Canadian soldiers to Brits. I decided to do something about it, he wrote. I sewed a couple extra patches and oddments onto my uniform. Nobody was any wiser, and stormed them. I did all right. On October 16th, Russell Allen Phillips, wearing his dress uniform and captain's bars, stepped off a train in Indiana. He'd been gone for 4 years. His mother, his sister, and a throng of friends were there. A telegram had come from his father, who was soon to return home from Europe. Thank the Lord, great day has arrived. Welcome home, my son. There, too, was the woman whose image had sustained him. Cece was in his arms at last. At Kelsey's home in Princeton, they sat Alan down on the front steps, and he grinned while they snapped his picture. When they got the print back, someone wrote one word on it, home. And here you can see it says Russell Allen Phillips arrives at his mother's house, and someone wrote home on the back. 4 weeks later, in a wedding ceremony officiated by Reverend Phillips at Cece's parents' house, the hero finally got the girl. Alan had no car, so he borrowed one from a friend. Then, as he had promised in a letter so long ago, he ran away with Cece to a place where no one would find them. Pete was so anxious to see Louis that he could hardly bear it. The fighting had ended in mid-August. It was now October, and still Louis was hospital hopping far from home. Then Pete learned that Louis was finally stateside, transferred from Hawaii to San Francisco's Letterman General Hospital. As soon as he got the news, Pete went AWOL. He bummed a ride to San Francisco on a Navy plane, hitched his way to Letterman, and walked in. At the front desk, he called Louis's room. A minute later, Louis bounded into the lobby. Each felt startled by the sight of the other. Pete had expected Louis to be emaciated, starving, skinny, and was surprised to find him looking almost portly, kind of chubby. Louis was disturbed to see how the years of worry had depleted his brother. Pete was gaunt, skinny, and he'd gone largely bald. The brothers fell together, eyes shiny. Pete and Louis spent several days together in San Francisco while doctors finally cured Louis of his dysentery. After reading the Trumbull article, Pete had worried that Louis might be severely traumatized, but as the two laughed and kidded each other, his fears faded. Louis was upbeat and garrulous as ever. Once, when a group of reporters shuffled in to interview Louis, they crowded around Pete, assuming that of the two men, this haggard one, or this, poor-looking one, had to be the POW. Now, note here that Pete is scared that Louis is going to have trauma. Of course Louis will have trauma. He's just been through years of torture and abuse. But Louis is not thinking about it. He's just going on, he's partying, he's excited to be home. And so at this moment, Louis is not paying attention to any of those things. On a drizzling October day, the Army sent a banged-up B-25 to San Francisco to bring Louis home. Pete, still AWOL, went aboard with his brother. The plane lifted off and rose over the clouds to a shining blue morning. Scared to death of flying, Pete tried to distract himself from the plane's rattles and groans by staring out over a carpet of bright clouds, the upside of the rainstorm. He felt as if he could step from the plane and walk on them. Over Long Beach, they sank back into the rain and landed. There, bursting from Army cars, were their mother and father, and Sylvia and Virginia. The moment the plane stopped, Louis jumped down, ran to his sobbing mother, and folded himself around her. "Cara mamma mia," he whispered. It was a long time before they let go. And here you can see the picture. The caption says, "This is Louis' homecoming at Long Beach Airport." Left to right, we've got Virginia and Sylvia. And then here we've got Louise and Louis. And on that beautiful note, we'll pause.